All right, Gospel Backgrounds 27. This is the Community Discourse, and it covers Mark 9, 1 through 34, and Matthew 17, 14 through 18, 1. We're actually going to break this up into two sections. It's a bit of a longer passage. In fact, the official Community Discourse we won't get to until next lesson, and that can be found in Matthew 18. So this section contains the verses, all things are possible, and with faith as small as a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So clearly there's been some out of context application of these verses, particularly a philosophy that goes by name it and claim it, or as Chuck Missler used to say, blab it and grab it. The prosperity crowd that says if you just have enough faith, then you can get that Mercedes, or you can get that new house, or all things like that. And so clearly it's not Jesus' intent to teach his disciples that if they only had enough faith, they could get that nice shiny new car and have very simple, easy, stress-free lives. So again, Acts 17:11, let's examine the scriptures together and let's look at some things that Jesus might have meant. We do have to infer some things and we'll speculate some things, but again, we always want to come back to this verse in Acts and make sure we're grounded in scripture. So the topics here, we'll start with the 9 who couldn't. So if we remember from last couple of lessons, Peter, James, and John went with Jesus up to the mountain. They had the transfiguration, and then now they're coming back down from the mountain, and we're going to encounter the remaining 9 disciples who could not do this miracle. And so this kind of creates a little scene. The scene is this man who is a father, and his son is demon possessed, and Jesus has an interesting little dialogue with the father about the father's kind of the status of the kid, and then the man makes a statement, if you can, and Jesus says, if I can, and then the man says, I believe, help my unbelief. And that's just a great picture of our status. I think we want to believe, and yet often we don't. And then the next thing the disciples say, well, why couldn't we do this? And Jesus says, the faith with a mustard seed, with the faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains. So let's look a little bit at what that might be. What is that kind of faith? So in our map, we are along the gold dashed line. Get my pointer here. So we're along here. So Jesus, box 7 would have been the transfiguration, and so now they're coming down from the mountain. We presume the first part of it is going to take place in the villages around Caesarea Philippi, so we're still in the same vicinity. And then it says he's going to leave that area and then go privately through Galilee. Of course, we don't know the exact route he took, but the dashed gold line here could be plausible. And eventually, we're going to end up back down in our old familiar stomping grounds, Capernaum. And when they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around them and the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, were amazed and ran to greet him, saying, "Why, or what were you arguing about with them?" So it's interesting. We aren't told where this is. Again, most scholars assume that we're in one of the villages around Caesarea Philippi. And so if that's the case, then most likely this is not the temple establishment that's arguing here. These would be the local leaders, the local, townsfolk of the synagogue. And we're about to learn that what they're arguing about was a demon-possessed boy that the 9 remaining disciples could not heal. And this was probably creating an awkward situation. Maybe the town had heard about all the rumors and how they had, cast out demons before, but yet they were not able to do here. And so what are you guys, a bunch of fraudsters here? So when Jesus asks, what are you arguing about? It's not about some point of the law, but it's more likely that they have compassion on this boy, and they're kind of wondering what's going on here with the healing, and so they're definitely not in opposition to Jesus' overall ministry. And as you might note, Lancaster in his commentary frequently gives the local leadership the benefit of the doubt, unless the text specifically tells us otherwise. And I think that's a good model to follow. Now, in his case, he's a Messianic Jew, so that makes sense. He's experienced anti-Semitism. He's experienced being called a Judaizer by the members of the Gentile church merely for doing what we're doing, right? Looking at the underlying historical and cultural context. So sometimes this is with malicious intent, and other times it's just because of bad teaching. But a lot of Gentile Christians have the interpretation, all Jews good, good. I'm sorry, all Jews bad, all Christians good. So hopefully through our study you can see that this overgeneralization is not fair, and it's not always the case. But I think the deeper truth is, what I like about what Lancaster does is he may not be right all the time. I may not agree with him all the time, but he errs on giving another the benefit of the doubt. He does not assume bad motives. And I think that's how God would have us behave. So too often we're quick to judge another's intent when we don't know the whole story. That's true when reading the Bible, and it's also true in our day-to-day lives, I think. There's an example. My wife was selling a house a couple of weeks ago. Her sellers got a good offer, and they executed the contract, but about a day later, the buyers said, "We're pulling out. We can't go through with it." And of course, the sellers were angry. And the first response, "Wait, you can't do that. You just signed a contract. We stopped showings. We lost other buyers. What are you trying to pull?" Kind of was their reaction. There's actually a buzz phrase in real estate. I don't know if you've heard it. It says buyers are liars, and there's thousands of examples where buyers are liars. Buyers are, they have suspicious motives. They're not being genuine. They're not being upfront. However, in this specific case, what they later learned was the previous night, a close family member of the buyer had been in a terrible accident and was in critical condition. So of course that changed everyone's perspective. Of course, things happen. We understand and rip up the contract kind of thing. And so it's just, we don't always know what's going on. And an everyday example is when someone cuts you off on the road and you get angry. You don't know what's going inside the other person's head, right? So they may be that way all the time, or maybe something terrible just happened and they need our mercy. So I like the fact that we're called to give someone else the benefit of the doubt. We shouldn't prejudge, because we've all been there, right? We've probably been distracted ourselves and not paying attention and did something dumb on the road and got honked at and didn't feel good, right? So anyway, just kind of a tangent here to give someone else the benefit of the doubt. And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." So teacher, I brought you my son. So the Greek word here that describes his condition is something like moonstruck. They call it seizures, but or epilepsy in some translations, but that's really kind of based on the boy's symptoms. This is not really a normal medical ailment. So this is a demonic spirit that throws the boy into epileptic-like seizures, and it's has something to do with the phases of the moon. So it's kind of creepy stuff. So Keener makes a very astute observation here that I really really never thought of before. Just like Moses came down from the mountain and he had to deal with the failure of those he left in charge. If you remember that story, there was the incident of the golden calf. Jesus similarly has to deal with the failure of those whom he left in charge when he came down from the mountain. So just that parallel I thought was really interesting. This is a quote from Deuteronomy 32:5. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are not his children. It is their blemish. They are a perverse and crooked generation. So Jesus' pronouncement echoes this passage, which describes the generation that was doomed to wander and die in the wilderness, when that generation could have been the ones to inherit. Jesus' words do seem harsh, and we don't really know who he's directing these to. It could be the disciples, but it shouldn't be the Father, because the Father's bringing his Son in faith. The disciples earnestly tried but failed. Something about the onlookers. What's kind of bringing this about? So Lancaster sees this as a statement that's generally directed at the spiritual malaise of Jesus' generation in that time. So just like the Exodus generation, the people in Jesus' day stood at a crossroad, right? When we take Jesus and John the Baptist's words at face value, if that generation had repented and believed, then the kingdom of heaven would have been at hand. So a plausible theory held by many scholars, but certainly not all, is that if that generation had believed, then the Messianic kingdom would have been ushered in that day. But just like the Exodus generation, they also had the potential to miss the opportunity and go into exile, and that's exactly what happened. So the boy's symptoms then it could be representative of the satanic influences that were rendering the entire population, and it appears out, apparently including the disciples, deaf and mute. So perhaps the disciples' inability to exorcise the boy's demon foreshadows the coming doom on the nation. So anyway, things to think about here. One of the things I'm learning through the study is that all of the people, and I've said this before, all of the people in these stories that Jesus interacts with, they somehow represent you and me. So I think it's worth analyzing each scene and seeing, who all the like reading a script, right? Who are the onlookers, who are the main characters, kind of what's going on with them. So in this case, we have the boy in trouble, we have the desperate father, we have the arguing scribes, we have the failed 9 disciples, and then we also have the onlookers, which in this case includes Peter, James, and John, who had just come from the mountain. So whoever Jesus is directing these words to, I think they can apply to us because we're somewhere included in that group of people. And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, meaning the evil spirit, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it has often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on him and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. I think it's fascinating to study the differences in the various healings. For example, in the demoniac at Gadara, Jesus has a conversation directly with the demon, right? And you've got this, who's your name? But here, almost like a doctor, Jesus is questioning the boy's father, trying to find out about the symptoms and how long has this been happening, and kind of describing it, describe everything to me. The detail that Mark goes into, it's if one were to take out the discourses in Matthew, Mark would actually be a longer book, and we've just kind of been noticing the details that Mark includes that the others don't. So we get to the first of our verses that people like to claim, where it says all things are possible with God, which is fine. That's absolutely true. All things are possible. But as Lancaster says, not all things are probable. The boy's father really exemplified this dichotomy. So the man did believe in the power of God to heal, but he doubted whether he would heal in the situation. So just because you can doesn't mean you will. And this is understandable, as the father apparently had been praying for years. And we know that God does not always comply with our petitions, right? So no amount of faith, whatever we mean by that term, will ever force God into granting our wishes if it's not God's will. So conversely, a person holding a few reasonable doubts does not disqualify from answered prayer. This man exemplifies that, right? So this man had some doubts, and yet Jesus healed the son anyway. So I think "I believe, help my unbelief" is a motto really for our predicament. We all believe that God can answer our prayers, but we do not always believe that he will. Mark adds a detail that the crowd was assembling. So why is that? Why would this alter Jesus' decision making? I think the best guess is that Jesus' ministry has now become much more private. He doesn't need or want 1,000 people to see a miracle and then go tell 1,000 more. So we have a private miracle, and then just an interesting lesson on belief and unbelief, and how they're not always opposite. Sometimes they go hand in hand. And the Matthew passage says, "The disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' He said to them, 'Because of your little faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" And then some manuscripts have a verse 21, "This kind goes out not but by prayer and fasting." And that 21 aligns with the Mark recount of this, when the disciples asked him, "Why could we not cast it out?" And Jesus said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Keener notes that mature disciples, which our gang of 9 should have been by this stage, were expected to carry on in their master's absence. So clearly they, wondering what just happened. Why didn't this, why weren't we able to do this? The descriptions, we actually have a bit of a contradiction. So Matthew has the disciples failing because they didn't have enough faith. Mark has them failing because they weren't adequately prepared, or as a pastor of mine used to say, they weren't pre-prayered. Given the explanation in verse 29 of Mark 9, and then what we see in some manuscripts in verse 21 of Matthew 17, we have to consider the possibility that verse 20 has maybe been misplaced and belongs somewhere else. We can't be sure about that, but it is a possibility because it does seem uncharacteristic of Jesus to chide disciples who came to him with a genuine question. And then we have verse 21 that aligns with Mark 9. So can't be sure about that, but in fact, it's probably best if we assume the verse belongs here. But I'm just throwing that out there just something to think about. Lancaster continues, can the disciples be criticized for a lack of faith when they had exorcised demons before? In fact, as I think about it, it was probably just the opposite. I think they likely were thinking, hey, stand aside, I got this. In other words, they had plenty of faith in their ability to exorcise a demon. Lancaster throws out a possibility that the disciples were questioning their own level of faith, and we can't be sure about this. But this would change the whole complexion of the passage. Now, this may not be as far-fetched as it seems. I'm not a super Greek scholar or anything by that stretch, but my understanding is that with Greek, as with English, sometimes questions are formed simply by voice inflection. In English, we have a question mark, but in Greek and Hebrew, there's no punctuation mark. There are interrogative pronouns, which are the most common way to ask questions and which way translators know that a question is being asked. But it is possible that Jesus could be saying, because of your lack of faith. In other words, do you think it's because of your lack of faith? So like the disciples doubted, and Jesus saying it's not because of your lack of faith. And actually, in this possibility, what Jesus continues to say makes a ton more sense. They did have enough faith. One only needs the faith as small as a mustard seed to move a mountain. But this demon was so entrenched, or demonologically advanced, we could say, that this kind only comes out by extensive preparation, prayer and fasting. So see how that tone changes from chastisement to encouragement? And to me, I have no idea if this theory is correct or not, but it seems to be much more consistent with Jesus' general approach when someone is asking a legitimate question, as the disciples were here. When I read the Gospels, Jesus usually reserves rebukes and chastisements for those who think they already have the answers. We kind of talked about that in the John 4 section, where a lot of people see Jesus as chiding the woman at the well, and Dr. Eli had a different take in his commentary. So I think it's just worth looking at. And with this interpretation, then the whole "you didn't get what you wanted because you didn't have enough faith," it's proven all the more wrong. Our faith or lack thereof is not the issue. Any believer can conjure up, at least the most insignificant, minuscule faith the size of a mustard seed, right? We don't get our desired outcomes because of our faith that is not even the size of a mustard seed. We don't get what we want because there are other factors in play, such as an advanced demon that only comes out by prayer and fasting. So I don't know if that makes sense, but it kind of resonated with me, which is kind of why I just kind of exploring the possibility that when Jesus says because of your lack of faith, it may be more of an affirmation statement rather than a chastisement. I wish we had time to chase down all the mountain and stone references of the Bible. It would be a very worthwhile study, but we'll look at one on the next slide. So remember when Jesus had just come down from the mountain, and then in the next scene, Jesus says, "You will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move." I once heard a former Muslim who had converted to Christianity, and he often said that the Bible is an Eastern-based book, and we would say, "You Westerners have no idea the half of what you're reading," and he was an Arab. So a situation we're trying to remedy with this study, by the way. We're trying to dig into some of the context. He said that in a Middle Eastern culture and in the Bible, mountains is a symbol for kingdoms. He would quote former Iranian President Ahmadinejad, who once said, "Islam will rise over all the mountains." And his meaning was clear, right? Islam was going to take over the world, politically speaking. So a faith that moves mountains is a faith that dislodges these kingdoms. And this would actually seem to fit with the demonic kingdoms as well as earthly kingdoms. If you read Daniel 9, there's they might be one and the same, right? Because each kingdom of that age had an angel, not a good angel, behind it, a supernatural angel. So in this respect, the verse ends with "Nothing is impossible." And I think given what we've talked about with the potential sinister and demonic goings on at this location, Jesus is dislodging that entity, that political entity of demons from that mountain. Today, we go there, and like I mentioned a couple of lessons ago, you can go to Caesarea Philippi. There's no goat sacrifice. There's no idol worship. There mostly are Christians celebrating the declaration that Jesus is the Messiah. So here Jesus had just cast a demon, and if demons made a home in Mount Hermon, an application could be that through faith in Jesus, his Talmudim will dislodge the territory formerly held by these pagans and demons. I think history bears out that that was the case. Finally, the verse ends with "Nothing is impossible." I think, as we've talked about, there's a major caveat here. The faith that you have has to invoke his power to move the mountain, if that is his will. I know the text doesn't directly say this, but I think, given the all kinds of erroneous application of this passage by, word of faith people, I think when people apply this passage to mean I can get whatever I want as long as I label it faith, they're not talking about faith in God. They're talking about faith in their own abilities. And so the whatever I want is their will, not God's will. So again, we just need to keep it in perspective. The small faith inside a man does not move a mountain. It's the powerful God inside the man who places his faith in God, and that's who moves the mountain. Then they went on from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise." But they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. And I think that's a peculiar statement. Even more peculiar is what is written in Luke. They were all marveling at everything he was doing. Jesus said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is about to be delivered." They did not understand the saying, and it was concealed from them so that they could not perceive it. That is quite interesting. And they were afraid to ask what he was saying. So let's unpack this a little bit on the next couple of slides. They went out from there and passed through Galilee, and he did not want anyone to know it. So of course we looked at a possible route on the map to begin this lesson, but of course we don't know the direct, obvious, real route. But this picture here shows a typical scene in the Upper Galilee, kind of not too far from Mount Hermon. So it's in the springtime. It's absolutely beautiful. So this comment, I think, he did not want anyone to know it. I think it explains the comment in verse 25 where Jesus, hastened the miracle when he saw the crowd coming, and that kind of changed his timeline a bit. Jesus had kind of been there, done that with large crowds and miracles, and kind of didn't want to go there again. And then furthermore, the path to Jerusalem is now clear. Jesus had no need to avoid the territory of Antipas in fear of a premature arrest. I think, by now he realizes he's in charge of the timeline, and he needed to continue to reveal this to the disciples, but privately, not in front of a large group. So as he explained it again, and so as Luke puts it, the words would sink in, but then it says they weren't unwilling to respond. They were made unable to respond through no power of their own. Luke says the things were concealed from them. So that's kind of interesting, that a truth would be concealed from even his disciples. So that's interesting. But in any case, as we've said many times, a suffering Messiah was not at all on their radar. So given all this, I think we need to cut the disciples a little slack. A lot of times we chide them for being dense, and maybe that's deserved. But we need to look at it from their shoes and give them some grace. So verse 32, I find like maybe the most puzzling. They were afraid to ask him. I'm going to assume, I'm going to hope that they were afraid to ask because they didn't want to hear the answer, or they didn't want to look dumb by asking, and not because they thought Jesus was in some way unapproachable. But anyway, that's a peculiar verse, because the thought is when we have when we get to heaven, we're going to have all kinds of questions, and maybe we're going to be afraid to ask too. Now we're back in our old stomping grounds, Capernaum. When they came to Capernaum, the collectors of the 2 drachma tax went up to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the tax?" And Peter said, "Yes." And when he came to the house, Jesus spoke to him first, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do kings of the earth take toll or tax? From their sons or from others?" And when Peter said, "From others," Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. However, not to give offense to them, go to the sea and cast a hook and take the first fish that comes up. And when you open its mouth, you will find a shekel. Take that and give it to them for me and for yourself." This is kind of a unique perspective. This picture was taken in 1968, so way before the days of drone photography. You can see the top of the synagogue, and then the Greek Orthodox Church of Capernaum is sort of in the upper center of the screen. Today, those domes are like bright pink, so they're rather obvious. I don't know if they were painted since then, or if this was a colorized picture or what. But anyway, it's a kind of an interesting shot. So as a chronological note, Lancaster notes that this temple tax that we're talking about was always conducted in the month of Adar, or February or March timeframe. Basically right a month or so before the Passover that was in the following month in the spring. If that's the case, then we're a bit out of order, just pointing this out. We still have to circle back to the Gospel of John, and John chapter 10 is Hanukkah, which is in December. So it would have been, that scene would have been the December prior to this scene with St. Peter's fish. So not a big deal, just pointing it out. So note that these are not Roman tax collectors. They are representatives of the temple in Jerusalem, and this tax is actually based in Scripture in Exodus 30. So it's not a Roman tax. The collectors were not cheats. They did not have the bad reputation as the Roman tax collectors did. That they were so hated by the people. So this tax was collected again right before Passover, and it was used to purchase flocks and supplies for the sacrifices. It was a community offering, so this allowed all Israel to share in the sacrifices. So it was a sanctioned task. However, the question asked by the collectors is a fair one, because other Jewish groups of that day, including the Essenes, they were very critical of the corrupt temple establishment, and then they claimed that they were exempt from the temple tax because they were not part of the system. So potentially they wanted to know if Jesus was going to similarly claim some tax exempt status. So basically the Essenes had said, we're not part of this, we're seceding, if you want to use that term. And they're asking, hey, Jesus, are you seceding too? So in a sense, this actually pokes a big hole in the argument that says Jesus came to upend Judaism, because he didn't do that. He argues that the tax should not be paid. He argues that the tax is unfair because a royal family does not tax itself. So he's placing himself at the head of that family. He is the hope of Judaism. He is not breaking with solidarity. But because of that solidarity, and for the sake of keeping the peace, not causing offense, he tells Peter to go ahead and make the payment. So we all like it when Jesus overturns the tables, but note he does the exact opposite here, which I find fascinating. And it's almost a similar situation. It's a few months from now, or maybe even a month later, by Lancaster's timeline, he's going to overturn the tables in Jerusalem because of the money changers. So they who were making a profit, not biblically so. I think this is a great example of the last part of Romans 12, especially verse 12 to 18. But let's just look at this entire passage, because I think we can all take it to heart. Contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse them. Rejoice with those who rejoice. Weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be haughty, but associate with the lowly. Never be wise in your own sight. Repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And then verse 18, if possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. So don't go picking fights, and don't go arguing to cause discord, that kind of thing. Beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. For by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. So basically, you get back at them by being nice to them. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. I love that passage, and yet I fail to live it all too often. So this is today. It's known as St. Peter's fish. It's actually a dish that you can get when you go to one of the restaurants, and the tour buses will all stop, and kind of remember the scene. So it's kind of fun. It's a mushed fish, and it's in the tilapia family. So and again today it's known as St. Peter's fish. I don't know about you, but boy, given this story, I sure would like Jesus to show up around April 15th some year and say, hey, can I go drop a line in and have my tax bill paid? In fact, some might say the greater miracle is that Peter dropped his line and immediately caught a fish. So that's never happened to me, by the way. So all right, back to our narrative. When he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. So potentially being, included in seeing Jesus in his glory, along with Moses and Elijah, that might have led to some sense of privilege among Peter, James, and John. And we don't know who initiated this argument or why they did. We do know that Peter, James, and John were forbidden to relay the specifics, so maybe there might have been one too many. Boy, you sure missed out. Why weren't you there? Oh, that's right, you weren't invited. So remember, these were teenage boys we're talking about, which are not necessarily the epitome of maturity. So in addressing this question, Jesus is going to go into what is known as the Community Discourse, and it is in Matthew 18, and that is rather lengthy, so we're going to stop here and we're going to pick up with part 2 in Matthew 18 next time. So let's look at this lesson, and as I've said before, kind of that is us, right? Everyone Jesus interacts with is us in some respect. And if we just look at the disciples, there's a time where they're powerless and they need Jesus to kind of step in. They're confused and worried as they walk along the way. They are teachable, as Peter learned. You don't always fight, although maybe Peter didn't learn that. Maybe that's a bad example, because in the garden he fought back when he should have been not caused offense. And then they're proud. So we're all of these things, and we look at how Jesus responds and reacts to these. And we're going to learn a lot about living in community in the next lesson. So may God richly bless you, my beloved, as J. Vernon McGee says, and we will catch you next time.